Mexican Revolution is the sequel of the Porfirian period and the events that defined Mexico of the 20th century. We will discuss the complex process of destroying the oligarchic state and the neo-colonial period of the end of the 19th century. The shooting started on November 20th, 1910. Porfirio Diaz was in his 8th term as president and was celebrating the 100th anniversary of Mexican independence and his 88th birthday. The implied message was simple. He and Mexico were the same. The celebrations were extraordinary. An entire season of parades, balls, receptions of foreign dignitaries, the opening of such monuments as the Angel of Independence and the Palace of Fine Arts, still not completed but already featuring its unique Tiffany curtain. Diaz was lauded by the foreign press and hailed for the outstanding accomplishments of his regime. For such significant projects as the building of the hydraulic system that brought water to Mexico City. All agreed that peace and progress were beautiful. In July 1910, a month after his 8th election victory, we see Diaz honoring Benito Juárez at a ceremony against whom he had once risen in revolt. He is seated upon a chair designed to resemble a throne. He looks stern, even monolithic, in a patriarchal way, while the people who lived off his patronage are assembled modestly to his right in proper solemnity. In his gloved left hand, he holds a cane as if it were a scepter. During the celebrations, there was an immense self-satisfied glow among the people who had prospered under Don Porfirio. At that moment, however, there were different factions. The scientists, the reyistas, the liberals, the anti-re-electionists, the agrarians, trying to regain their lands taken away from them by the hacendados. They all had different claims and were trying to control power. But after promising a revolution in November 1910, a band of 130 revolutionists crossed the border from Texas in February 1911. Their improbable leader was a son of the Porfiriato named Francisco Madero. He was a small, intense man, something of a mystic, something of an intellectual, who wanted free elections and greater social justice for all Mexicans. Above all, Madero wished to end the re-election system, which had perpetuated Diaz in power for 34 years. He had been jailed for his pains, escaped in the clothes of a railroad brakesman, and then plotted an armed revolt from a refuge in San Antonio, Texas. No project seemed more quixotic, but the fighting soon spread, driven by the people's rage that the novelist Mariano Azuela would call los de abajo, the underdogs. Railroad cars were blown off their tracks, grand haciendas were invaded and sometimes destroyed, their owners fleeing to the safety of Mexico City or into exile. Several Catholic sectors were influenced by renovated social ideas and supported by the Vatican, who had just proclaimed the Rerum Novarum encyclical. pretending to offer a Christian solution to the social conflicts. This encyclical had been drawn for the European countries, and Mexican Catholics wanted to adapt it to the rural area. These problems, together with the protesting of the concentration of the agrarian property and the working conditions of the haciendas, was the spark for the convulsion to start. Much of the fighting was in the countryside in the state of Morelos, to the immediate south of the capital. A man named Emiliano Zapata rose to the Madero cause, demanding land and liberty, and an agrarian reform for all Mexico, and waged brilliantly guerrilla warfare against the forces of the regime. But the decisive victory of the revolutionaries was scored in Ciudad Juárez, far to the north, near the river that formed the border with the United States. The stunning victory was gained against the wishes of the moderate liberal Madero, who hoped for negotiation, by two men, Pascual Orozco and a bandit named Doroteo Arango, who preferred to be called Francisco Villa. Pancho Villa would soon be famous all over the world. 7 months after Madero announced the revolt, 4 months after he crossed the border, Porfirio Díaz was gone. In June 1911, he left from the port of Veracruz on a ship called Ipiranga, bound for exile in Paris, where he would die 4 years later and where his bones remain interred. His departure set up celebrations in many places, with Mexicans climbing to the roofs of the streetcars in Mexico City to proclaim success. But the joy was certainly not unanimous. In the lower right corner of this photograph, a lone man in a business suit walks away, clearly unhappy. It was soon obvious that Madero's victory was only the curtain of the first act. Much more blood would be shed before the end of the great drama. In this picture, we see Madero hatless in an era when most men wore hats. There are boys in the crowds, some of them bootblacks, and the inevitable foot soldiers guarding the new man in Mexican history. There is a suggestion of uneasy peace in the scene. In October 1911, Madero was elected president of the Republic. He would only last 16 months in power. During those months, there were free elections and a complete change in the political pyramid. The peace did not hold. In Morelos, Zapata thought that Madero was too slow in implementing land reform and soon rose in arms again. The American ambassador Henry Lane Wilson, believing that Madero was a dangerous radical, was soon conspiring to get rid of him. In 1913, Madero was overthrown in a coup d'etat by an old Diaz commander named Victoriano Huerta. After his election, the idealistic Madero had retained Huerta and other Diaz officers, believing that their primary loyalty was to Mexico. He was wrong. Huerta forced him to resign at gunpoint and 2 days later had him executed, along with his vice president. The double murder set off the most terrible years of the revolution, announced by 10 days of heavy fighting in Mexico City. An episode called La Decena Trágica, the tragic 10 days. Don't miss our next video, The Mexican Revolution #2.